To start with, this video will be split into two parts. The first video will take a look at how the Convention on the Law of the Sea was established and how it developed over time. And in the second video, I will tell you who exactly owns what part of the ocean and therefore controls its riches. What is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? Simply put, it is an international agreement that establishes a legal framework for all marine and maritime activities. Basically, that means that this framework tells a country where its maritime borders are, and what they are permitted to do within those borders, as well as what rights they have outside of their jurisdiction zone. Between the 15th and 17th century, various countries claimed sovereignty or absolute power over parts of the sea. In the beginning of the 17th century, a Dutch philosopher wrote what is now considered to be the foundation of international doctrine regarding the use of the oceans. Mare liberum. Roughly, it translates to freedom of the seas. It stresses the freedom to navigate the oceans and at the same time disapproves of war, fought and water. States mainly concern themselves with the sea for two reasons. The main reason was to navigate the oceans as a means of communication between states. The second minor reason was to use the ocean as a means of a resource where the state's population was able to fish in a very narrow band of sea near the shore. However, the sea was also a place from which the enemy could invade, which means that thoughts on security have always accompanied the establishment of the law of the sea. The earliest form of the law of the sea is based upon two very simple rules. The coastal state could execute sovereignty or absolute control over a narrow band of sea along its coast. At this time, most countries had adopted a 3 nautical mile territorial limit. These 3 nautical miles were, as some say, a result of the cannon's reach placed in forts to protect the boundaries of that country. All waters outside the reach of cannons and therefore outside the boundaries of that country was considered to be high seas and therefore international waters. Considering the technological advancement of this time, the sea was extremely vast and the ability of men working it extremely limited. Skipping forward to the 20th century, the world had made great technological advancements, which greatly influenced the law of the sea. It enabled us to start fishing very far away from the coast, and the need for resources buried within the ocean seabed, such as gas and oil, had also greatly increased. An idea that these resources should be controlled started to develop. In 1945, the US wanted to protect its resources and therefore extended its control to all the natural resources of its continental shelf. Other nations were soon quick to follow, and between 1946 and 1950, Chile, Peru, and Ecuador extended their rights to a distance of 200 nautical miles to cover their fishing grounds. In 1958, the first conference of what is now known as the Law of the Sea was held to determine if an international agreement could be reached for harmonizing the use of the oceans and its riches. This conference is widely believed to have been a major failure. However, contrary to popular belief, they did manage to produce 4 conventions and an optional protocol. These 4 conventions deal with the territorial sea and the contiguous zone, the high seas, fishing and conservation of the living resources of the high seas, and the continental shelf. But why end up with 4 conventions and an additional optional protocol instead of just one convention containing all of them? This was a very diplomatic decision. The ultimate desire was to have a broadly accepted convention which most, if not all countries would end up ratifying. There were a few states which had strong objections to some of the articles within the draft or to the discussions during the conference. These objections could have caused these states to refuse to ratify the convention altogether. For example, I like the Convention on the Law of the Sea, but I don't like Article 100 and therefore I won't sign or ratify it. Therefore, it was decided to split the convention into 4 parts, so that each state could ratify however many they wanted, with the hope that most states would at least ratify 3 out of 4 or 2 out of 4, if not all of them. And while they did manage to produce some great results, they did not find an agreement on one of the most important topics: the width of the territorial waters over which a state could have sovereignty over. states were opposed between the previously used 3 nautical miles. Others supported a 12 nautical mile width, while still others tried to aim for the middle ground of 6 nautical miles in order to come to some sort of agreement. The United Nations tried to tackle these problems with a second conference in 1960, trying to finally settle the dispute of the width of the territorial waters. However, this second conference failed miserably and is hardly mentioned since. Therefore, in the 1960s, most of Europe still had the 3 nautical mile territory law based on the politics from the 17th century. Pirate radio stations in Europe benefited greatly from this 3 nautical mile territory law. At the time, radio stations needed a license to play rock music, which was gaining in popularity. At the time, bands like the Rolling Stones and The Who were still scandalous and wildly controversial. These pirate radio stations, apart from playing rock and roll and pop music, also hosted other media such as comedy shows and shows which were not BBC approved.
That's the whole point of being the government. If you don't like something, you simply make it illegal.
The rise of the pirate radio stations was made possible due to this 3 nautical mile territory law. They decided to host the broadcast from either ships or old fortresses from World War II, which were still drifting or sitting well outside territorial waters. Mare liberum, freedom of the seas. So, authorities within the British government were powerless against them, as they were by law within international waters, and therefore not bound by any national laws which would have prohibited them from broadcasting.
We've got the wrong damn boat! Spectacular mistake.
So when these 4 conventions finally came into force in 1966, they were in a way already obsolete. Many colony countries gained independence in the mid-20th century, with a peak of decolonization during the 1960s. Their view on the law of the sea differed to the customary view of the first conference. A new majority of the newly independent states felt that they should have full sovereignty over a much larger body of water adjacent to their coast, far exceeding the previously discussed 3, 6, or 12 nautical miles. The majority of these countries were relatively poor countries. Their greatest concern were the foreign fleets of fishing vessels fishing in waters relatively close to their coast and very, very far away from their home port. For this reason, most of the newly independent countries refused to ratify the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and demanded a new conference where their interests were taken more into account. Having failed to come to an agreement during the second conference, most countries were relatively free to choose the width of the territorial waters over which they should have sovereignty over. By 1967, many nations had decided to extend their territorial water limit from 3 nautical miles to 12 nautical miles, which meant that only 25 nations still used the old 3 nautical mile limit, while 66 nations had set a 12 nautical mile territorial limit and 8 a 200 nautical mile limit. However, this wasn't the only reason as to why a new conference was held, even though it had basically just come into force. In 1967, the Maltese ambassador, Arvid Pardo, made a long and very impressive speech at the UN General Assembly. He had learned that very deep in the ocean and far away from the shore on the seabed, polymetallic nodules had been found, and that these polymetallic nodules, kind of potato-shaped rocks, contained important quantities of metals such as manganese, nickel, and cobalt, among others. In his opinion, these resources were far out of the jurisdiction of any one nation and that they should be exploited for the benefit of the entire humankind. In his opinion, the United Nations should create some sort of authority to ensure that these resources are exploited for the benefit of all. This got the United Nations thinking, and they agreed to establish the so-called Seabed Committee. But the problem is, how can you deal with polymetallic nodules outside of national jurisdiction if you don't know where national jurisdiction is? So in 1973, finally a new conference was held. They planned the conference to consist of a 12-week program, which was an unprecedented length of time. Everyone knew that the task ahead of them was huge, but estimated the time to be enough to work through all the agenda and produce a convention. This was very naive. In fact, it did not take them 12 weeks, but rather 9 years to produce this convention. The convention was finally adopted in 1982. During these 9 years, it was recognized that the 4 conventions from the first conference were a mistake and that they should have one convention containing all of them. Where the same rules apply to every country and without the option of reservations, they started to negotiate, and what was negotiated became negotiated text, which would later become the written draft convention submitted to be adopted by consensus. Things were going quite well until there was a change in politics in the United States of America, with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1981. Ronald Reagan decided that the Law of the Sea negotiations were the most visible example of what he didn't like in the United Nations and in international politics. He said that the US would continue to negotiate, but they would have to make some radical changes, especially in the seabed mining part. The UN tried to make some adaptations, but in the end it was the common opinion that this was a futile attempt and that the US would not budge on its standpoint. The US stood to lose a lot of seabed mining area if they were to sign as agreed within the new Law of the Sea. And even though this convention was adopted by vote in 1982, the US weren't the only state who had a problem with the seabed mining part. Many states, including some European countries, signed the convention but did not want to ratify it until the part on the seabed mining was made more acceptable. In 1990, this convention was on the verge of failing again. This convention was to soon come into force because ratifications were slowly coming in, but especially for a group of developing countries which had not been industrialized yet. This was dangerous because the convention, which was conceived as universal, would come into force but would not be representative of the world as a whole, as major states had not ratified the convention. Developing states simply would not have the resources to finance the institutions which were to be created. In order to prevent this convention from failing, informal negotiations were held with the states which had objections to ratifying the convention. The part on the seabed mining was radically changed due to these informal negotiations. An agreement on Part 11, which is the seabed mining, was created to be implemented along with the convention. The adoption of this implemented agreement caused the industrialized states not to insist on their objections and finally ratify the convention. The only major state which thereafter still refused to ratify the convention until this day was and is the US. To date, 167 states have joined the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.